Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks to everyone who tuned into this exciting and very timely panel exploring themes of diversity, equity, and inclusion for young learners and their communities. As you all know, this year has challenged us all to be extremely resilient and also in every aspect in our lives. So not only do we have to confront the daily health pandemic of COVID-19, but there are so many challenges added to this one, and we might call them the pandemic of pandemics. Um, we will focus in the US. So let's take a moment to think about the well-being of our children and our students. This summer, the US has awakened to a long-standing issue, racial justice and equity. This movement has been supported by millions of people in the Americas and across the world. Particularly, Education for Sharing has committed to join the effort to create the monumental change needed. We believe change comes from educating minds and educating hearts. And we know one thing, we have to start from early ages, and we need to think on how to approach these matters rather differently. While social emotional learning is not a silver bullet to these long-standing and deep-seated inequities in the education system and in the system as a whole, it can definitely help schools to promote understanding, examine biases, reflect on and address the impact of racism, to build cross-cultural relationships and cultivate adult and student practices that close the opportunity gaps and to create a more inclusive school community. In doing so, schools can promote a high quality educational opportunity for all, and as well as outcomes for all students, irrespective of race, socioeconomic status, gender, sexual orientation, and any other difference. For this reason, we have invited three outstanding leaders and experts to discuss racial equity, inclusion, diversity in education through another lens, through another perspective. I am honored to introduce you to Tracy Jones, who is the Director of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. She's based in Boston, and she works on the school's strategic initiatives for diversity, inclusion, and belonging, and also facilitates diversity programming for students, staff, and faculty. Welcome, Tracy.
Thank you. Thank you for that introduction. I'm glad we're doing this panel because I think it's so important to talk about the double pandemic in which we're all experiencing, and that is the police violence that we're seeing against Black people, as well as COVID-19. And as we've read and heard, that we see that Black people, people of color, are actually experiencing COVID-19 and the death within when they do contract the disease. So it's something that we should be talking about when it comes to education. I think a lot of times we don't think about how these things impact our young people. And there's racial trauma when these things happen. So a lot of times we see our young people coming into schools, a part of the school community, and they may be saddened, they may be acting out, and we're not thinking about where this comes from. I also think parents aren't aware of this, right? Because that's not something that we talk about culturally, as well as a part of education. And when there are parent-teacher meetings, or when you're in your community and you're talking about your children. So I think it's important to have these conversations. In addition, when we're talking about diversity, inclusion, and belonging, we usually talk about one identity in which we hold. But when we think about the intersection of identity and how that impacts a child or children, or how they show up in a classroom or a community, I think it's important to talk about that. And I say that and would want you to think or reflect on, let's say, we're looking at a Black child who has a disability that is experiencing COVID-19, and then in a community in which everyone is an essential worker, right? think about the impact that that has on the child, as well as the trauma. Now we're not just talking about racial trauma, we're also talking about the trauma when it comes to ability. As we see that schools transition online or there's a hybrid education, that child is experiencing a difficulty in concentration as well as learning. So I just wanted to bring that into the space. One of the things that I did and our school did was create a library guide of about the Black experience during COVID-19. And we have contributions from regular folks, from children, from parents, from artists, just to talk about their experience in COVID-19. One, it provides us research information in real time, because typically researchers, they look at an issue and then write about it. But in real time, we're looking at contemporary information to see what that impact is, as well as to help inform our teaching and our learning. So I'm just going to drop it in the chat. And I don't want to go over my time. So I just want to turn it over to the next person.
Thank you so much, Tracy, for sharing that. Yes, let me go very quickly to introduce our other two amazing participants, panelists, who will share their wisdom today with us. We have with us Andy Reimer, who's a social impact consultant and associate at SidePorch.co, based in Los Angeles. SidePorch Consulting works across complex systems to take on the biggest challenges facing the world today by supporting values-aligned organizations so that they can develop strategy, operations, and partnerships that scale sustainable, accountable, and just solutions. Welcome, Andy. And also, I would like to introduce our dear David Adams, who is a senior director of strategy at the Urban Assembly based in New York. Urban Assembly is a nonprofit organization working to advance students' economic and social mobility by improving public education. The Urban Assembly has 23 high-performing small New York City public schools in the Bronx, Manhattan, Brooklyn. And welcome, David. So I would like to kick us off and start with Adam and David on a question that Tracy was sharing a little bit about. Please, in 5 minutes each, if possible, share why should we care about this issue? What are the implications, and what is it that we can do as parents and educators every day about this? So I suggest we start off with Andy, then Tracy, and then David. Thank you so much.
Sure, I'll be brief, but I think that one of the things that I want to highlight from Tracy is that this is everywhere. This is in the water that we drink, in the air that we breathe. It's constantly being learned by us unknowingly, and so we have to constantly unlearn these biases that we've been taught from a very young age. And it's a journey. We don't just wake up and we're woke. It's a journey. We have to continuously work on this as adults, and then also provide that teaching and support so that our students and our kids can also go through these unlearnings and know what the journey is like. And part of that journey, especially for folks who are not Black, like myself, is to understand the discomfort and being okay with that discomfort of understanding that in the world at large, and especially here in the United States, we have a system that was built on anti-Blackness, and consistently through institutional, individual means continues that anti-Blackness and oppression against our fellow colleagues and against young people at large. I think there's also a piece here of understanding and developing a shared language that we as educators and colleagues and humans can learn, as well as share with young people. I think that there are phrases that have come up that have spent decades and decades in certain spaces that are now becoming more commonplace. We have ice cream companies using words like white supremacy, which is really exciting. And also we have to be very aware of what those definitions are and understanding what that means. We utilize squishy terms like diversity and inclusion, and that could mean something very different to you than it does to me. And so getting on the same page and learning and discussing that and taking time and space to hold grace for each other as we learn that, I think is really critical. And along that learned language is a constant reevaluation of systems. In my work with nonprofits and municipalities and private companies, it's developing transparent, accountable systems. And then in my previous life of working in the nonprofit and education and social emotional learning space, it's about constantly reevaluating what is the data that we're tracking, what are the accountability standards that we're holding ourselves and our students to. Are we using words like grit and growth mindset and other critical terms in a way that is centering and empowering young people, or using it to blame and getting rid of the context and the settings that these young people live in? Last thing that I'll mention as well, a focal point of mine often is with young adolescents and social media, and trying to figure out how we can best develop critical habits around social media, because there's no way to fully get off of social media. But how do we teach folks how to be critical thinkers from an early age, where looking at who you follow, how to be critical thinkers of what is truth and what is fact. And then highlighting also what Tracy had mentioned earlier, Dr. Anita Carter has a really great presentation on the #Age of Trauma, which talks about how especially young Black men have been developing PTSD from watching folks like them get killed by police on social media. And so it's this double-edged sword. These police killings have been happening for a very long time, since the founding of police, when they were founded in this country to capture runaway slaves. And now that we have social media, it's becoming more aware to the broader public. And also there's the trauma that these young people are facing by seeing themselves killed on a consistent, way too consistent basis. But I'll pass it off to David and Tracy to follow through with the rest.
Thank you, Andy. Please, David, share with us.
Thank you. So first, Dina, thank you for the invite. And I think you asked the question, why does this matter? Right? Why does diversity, equity, inclusion matter? And what role does the education system play in promoting it? And to answer this question, I want to share a story of an Arctic wren. It's a little tiny bird like this, right? And this bird has the longest migration out of any other animals, 44,000 miles. It flies from pole to pole in order to reproduce. And when you think about this, you got to think, well, why does this animal spend so much energy flying across the world in order to reproduce? And the answer that nature has identified is that diversity matters. Right? The diversity of genes, diversity of experiences creates adaptability. So the question of why this matters is answered to us because this is not the only way to reproduce. You have worms who reproduce asexually. There was a snake recently in the zoo who just had it with guys and decided she was going to do it alone and asexually reproduced herself, right? But the fact of the matter is this is not the way that nature wants it to. Now, let's look at our country, right? We can see innovation hubs tend to be on the coast. Well, why? Well, coastal cities tend to have large exchanges of ideas which produce innovation, right? So the question here around diversity is a question that is answered for us. We know that adaptation and innovation comes from diversity. We also know from our experience from this little wren that it takes energy to make it happen. It's not that the wren just hangs out and diversity comes to it. No, it flies and it seeks this out. So those are the ways that we need to understand diversity. Organizations, countries, towns that do not have diversity in them will not be competitive. They will not be as adaptive as organizations that do, and they will not be able to compete against things that change. So that's the first answer. The second question is, what can we do? Right? We need to identify barriers to innovation and diversity and remove them. All right. So we know, for example, the House recently passed a bill around reducing barriers to innovation. Reducing barriers to diversity that came from the Obama era Congress, and that's still sitting in the House. And this House bill is focused on increasing diversity in schools and increasing diversity in towns and creating incentives for municipalities to do so. The question for me is, why wouldn't we want to do this? And I think the answer tends to be that folks are not willing to put the energy to figure out how to be in community and be in relationship with each other. And when we look at that answer, a question comes back. Our communities who don't have the level of diversity that others do will not be as competitive. To me, it's not a question of, do I want to do things? Do I not want to do things? Do I want to be a good person? Don't I want to be a good person? If you want to be in a competitive situation, you need to take the lesson from that little Arctic wren, and you need to find the diversity in your space so that you can be adaptive and competitive in the environments that you're operating in.
Wow, that is really inspirational, and I love how you bring the example of our inherent nature. No, it's really in the very basics of who we are as a planet, and I want to make sure that you all have access to this resource of the library that Tracy shared, that they have been building with lots of contributors from all over, and also make sure that all the people in the listening and tuning in, thank you for tuning in. We are very eager to learn from your questions, and really this is a panel for you. So yes, please share your cues, your questions and comments to have a dynamic discussion, and feel free to make any remarks on each other's participation. We have a question from our audience here. They say, ultimately, social emotional learning is about bringing a sense of agency, civic engagement, and giving a voice to students. So how can we facilitate their empowerment with developing appropriate opportunities and giving them a voice within their communities? What are some practical strategies that teachers and educators can do to promote this? Anyone?
Well, I will say, I recently had a conversation about this, and one thing that we need to do is think about the generational divide. So a lot of times we think about what young people are saying, that they're saying things are inappropriate, or they're saying things that actually are not factual. But it's factual for their lived experience and their environment and their community. And so I think sometimes teaching is learning, and teachers need to learn before they can teach. I also wanted to follow up on David's comment, and I totally agree. And I think one thing in the United States that we don't acknowledge is the segregation. So in order to have diversity and to create inclusion, you have to first name the segregation. It's historical, and that historical impact, then impacts the way in which we learn, the way we teach, and the way we live, and how we are in community. I would say that most people don't have access to information about race, in the history of African Americans, of Chinese Americans, of Japanese Americans, of Native Americans in the United States. And so there's this fear of the other. And in college, you typically don't have access to that information unless you choose it as a major or as an elective. So in order to be competitive and innovative, we need to acknowledge that we don't even know who we are or the space in which we operate. And so I think that's my long, short answer to that question.
Yeah, I'd like to follow up on that as well. So I think that the field of social and emotional learning has done a wonderful job at creating frameworks and tools that facilitate the type of interactions that allow for us to speak across difference. So let me give you an example. The concept of social awareness is when we give experiences to students that help them demonstrate the awareness of the role and value of others in the community. Well, when you operate off of that framework, the role and values of others in the communities, then the questions that flow from that is who's in my community and why? How do we value others? Why don't we value one person versus the other? How do I understand my community, right? Given that I have intersecting identities. And these are the kinds of conversations that start to create the opportunity for students to build community within their school, within their classroom, and then put them out so they can put their community, build community in larger spaces. Now, when you kind of dig down, you're talking about really simple tools, things like active listening. I mean, it's not rocket science, right? But it feels like it when somebody's shouting at you or saying things that really get you worked up. Learning how to listen, learning how to take perspective, right? One of the things that you'll see is when organizations or when systems or societies want to set up hierarchical or societies or hierarchical structures, right? They will intentionally limit the amount of perspective that people are exposed to through geography, through social media, through media, so that folks can't see themselves in the other, right? And so when we talk about social and emotional learning, it's about building these skills that create values around perspective taking, active listening, conflict resolution. And then we direct that towards the common good, right? What will it take for us to be in relationship with each other? What will it take for us to be in community with each other? And then how do we get together to work those differences out so that we can continue to work towards that common good? So I think those are the pieces. And that actually want to add one more thing here, the difference between learning and experiences. So the experiences that young people need are actually doing that, right? So the way you organize your school, the way you organize your classroom needs to have folks talking to each other, resolving differences across conflict. They need to be in decision-making situations. They need to be able to balance competing priorities. It's not just about talking. It's not just about teaching. It's about providing those experiences on a consistent basis in our instructional formats, our social and emotional supports, our behavioral supports, and our extracurricular activities.
I love that, David. I think that that's so key, and creating that space and time, which is seems so limited in teaching environments and in just everyday life. I think is so critical. I hear you as well. I love the concept that it takes energy, right? It takes energy to desegregate and it takes energy first to be aware of segregation. And then it takes energy to desegregate and diversify your workplace or your school or your classroom. And that doesn't just mean with individuals, but it also means with curriculum. It means with the books that you're reading. It means with the TV that you're referring to or the media that you're referring to. I think that is intertwined as well with the concepts of universal design learning. You know, the how we're able to, as educators, actively listen to each individual student and understand their experience and craft curriculum for that individual, I think is really key. I think there's also a larger discussion around the history and current worlds that we're living in and trying to understand, and to borrow a term from Indigenous mental health, decolonize mental health and decolonize the curriculum that you're a part of. And so, for example, I am Chinese and white mixed race, and specifically had to expend energy to learn about Chinese Americans' history and the institutions that brought and policies that brought Chinese folks over here to build railroads. But then also the policies that created what we now see as the model minority myth through certain immigration laws. And then I know that, for example, in the Northeast, you know, talking a lot about Indigenous and Native communities, but talked about it only in the past and saying and kind of it is assuming that that these communities no longer exist in the present. So this balance of the past and the present, and what David and Tracy have been sharing around building critical thinkers throughout this, I think enables what the question was around agency, civic engagement, and giving a voice to students, is enabling them to have that space to learn and push through and expend that energy to be critical thinkers and figure out where they want to be in those spaces.
Thank you so much. And really it's a matter of touching on basics, really, sometimes, no? Like learning what is segregation and to bring it to the table and to make sure that we are well aware of our history and that we name what needs to be named, and to create, yes, a dialogue, like David says, but it's not the dialogue only. It needs like a complement of structures that allow to have the right tools in place to allow that dialogue to go further and to go further into actual actions that really allow us to become that community that sees each other and recognizes each other, and as you very well say, Andy, that allows us to really use this universal design learning, no, as an experience. So thank you very much. We have lots of questions from the audience. I think you are really awakening a lot of curiosity and thirst for more of your wisdom to be shared. So one of the people in the audience says, now that COVID has pushed a lot more people towards digital communication, what new considerations have to be made when it comes to the impact of social media on diversity?
I mean, from my perspective, in terms of like being a diversity administrator, it's like, what information are we consuming? How are we consuming it? And are we critiquing it? Because it's easy to get caught up in the cycle of social media, Facebook, Instagram, TikTok. But who are your friends in those spaces? So if everyone looks like you and everyone thinks like you, are we actually even learning anything new? So being intentional about the information in which you consume. There's a positive side to the digital media now that, you know, we're experiencing COVID and we're in these insular communities, is that children are becoming more innovative. Parents are becoming more innovative, and educators are becoming more innovative. I know some educators who are doing their lessons on TikTok, and it's the way in which they're connecting with their young people. My sister has Circle Time. She is an early education teacher for special needs students, and they're from like 3 to 5. She does it real time on YouTube. And the parents are able to engage with her, and the children are like, oh, we know Miss Monica is here and talking to us and she's naming it. So teachers are thinking of different ways in which to engage their young people. So there is a positive side to this.
Thank you.
Yeah, I would agree with I'd agree with Tracy on this. I think that when we're thinking about the social media aspect of this, and Andy had mentioned this earlier, it's a question of where are we putting our energies in the context of diversity, right? I think the biggest challenge in social media is that it's our human tendency to want to be grouped with the like folks, and that creates a feedback loop in which you're not being challenged in your thought, which doesn't create refined thinking. And so I think when we look at what's happening in social media, I think the most important thing in context of COVID and diversity is how we are cultivating diverse points of view, so that we can refine our own thinking and help push the conversation forward.
That's so key, David and Tracy. I mean, I think a lot of folks may have watched the documentary that came out on Netflix earlier this summer called The Social Dilemma, that really highlighted how algorithms are put in place to create these bubbles because of which promote potentially misinformation and not this space to have these conversations or to be challenged on your own thoughts. And I think that the documentary could have gone a little bit further in discussing the bias of the folks that created the algorithms, right? computers are only as smart as we are, but that means the computers are only as biased as we are as well. And the majority of folks who are creating this are white men who have unintentional or intentional biases in creating these algorithms moving forward. I think it can also be a really, social media, as David and Tracy were talking about, is a great place to also potentially build community, right? When we're talking about diversity and inclusion, for me, I define diversity more in quantitative terms of who you're surrounding yourself with and the various identities. And then inclusion is the kind of qualitative, my background's in data measurement, so that's kind of why I'm thinking this way. But inclusion is a little bit more qualitative. And how are you feeling? Do you feel like you belong? Do you feel like you are, as the previous question asked, do you have agency? Can you thrive in there? Do you feel supported by the people around you? And there are places on social media that can build positive community. Tracy was giving examples of how TikTok is being used by educators, which I think is really impressive. I think that there are other groups out there, especially ones that are driven and led by teens who are wanting to talk about these issues much more openly. And I think that as educators at large and folks within kids' lives, being open to having these discussions on various different platforms and media places to enable further discussion and expending that energy. Again, coming back to David's point at the beginning of this, of creating that time and thinking about pushing past the bubble that this algorithm has created for you. And so you yourself as an individual, trying to be a better critical thinker of how you're and who you are following and how you're following them. And then how do we teach this at a young age? I was in a preschool a few years ago working with preschoolers on a project for grad school, and their favorite app was Snapchat, right? Because they love seeing their faces and the mirrors and the funny faces and all that, but they were one swipe away from the whole world. And then later that day, they were learning about empathy and compassion and how do you understand feelings. And I think that can be taught in an early age, that can be translated over time into social media world as well.
Just a quick follow-up on what Andy said. I think we need to be understanding of the difference between feeling good and refining the quality of our thinking. Feeling good is the point of engagement. And a lot of times we are in these spaces so we can feel good. Feeling good means listening to people who feel like you, act like you, speak like you. Refining your thinking and building quality is often feeling uncomfortable, right? So I just wanted to name that in order to get to that place, in order to expend that energy, it's often uncomfortable, which is why people don't do it, which is why you need to take that intentionality, as Tracy said, to get into the space where there are different kinds of views coming through, and that we need to focus on refining our thoughts, removing the burden of ignorance, right? So that we can make good decisions and move ourselves forward.
Yes, absolutely. So it's not any of these elements on its own is not enough, right? Innovation on its own, it's not enough if we don't know our story, our history, if we don't name things, if we have dialogue on its own, it's not enough. If we engage in social media, but just to get more of the same, or then we're not really pushing us forward to really be able to learn and to put ourselves, as you say, David, in outside of our comfort zone. This is the invitation, really, not that also Tracy was very beautifully putting, like how can we use this and turn it around as the most positive tool to really see what we don't see. So and going into the what we don't see, I want to ask you a question that I see here from the audience. So we all have biases and blind spots. And how can we go about this as an educator? How does this affect the ultimate goal of teaching students about equity, inclusion, and racial justice?
I think that's a great question, because a lot of times we don't acknowledge our bias, and not because we don't want to, is because there are so many thoughts that go through our brain. And typically we go with the first one that connects to our experiences over time. So it goes back to David in terms of refining your thinking. You have to think outside of the context of your lived experience. I started talking about segregation. If you know you come from a segregated community and you know that you don't have experiences other than the ones in which the people you exist with, then you are going to come up with a bias. Just naming that to yourself right there is a way to start to think about that. And when I talked about racial trauma, I think that's one of the ways in which we're educators, we should be thinking about where that bias comes in. That little boy is bad. She doesn't pay attention. So as you do that, not only are you impacting yourself as an educator, you're impacting that child and their education as it goes throughout their lifetime. In addition to that, you're impacting their wealth and the way in which they can build wealth. So sometimes I think you have to think about what are the implications of my bias when we do these things. And I think being intentional once again to stop and think before responding is important. And then I'll say lastly is if you don't refine your thinking, if you don't educate yourself with information that you don't have, then it's hard for you to address that bias. And I believe in ethnic studies. I live for ethnic studies. And I think if you're not aware of ethnic studies, that's one way in which you can interrupt the bias, and not just around Black, white, but around people of color and their history in this country.
Yeah, I agreed with what Tracy is saying. My experience, the only way that I have understood my biases is to be outside of the context that I operate in, and to have people who are different from me name my assumptions. We can't see the assumptions that we're making if everybody has the same assumptions as we do. When we talk about the importance of diversity, it's the ability for somebody who thinks in a different way, who analyzes problems from a different context, to speak to you around how you're addressing this situation. And that's just in a problem-solving way. I don't know that it is possible to see so deeply into yourself that you can name the assumptions that you have. And for example, I mean, I'm just thinking in the Army, we go through a process called a military decision-making process, and you actually name facts and assumptions. And, we make all sorts of bad decisions in the military. And even though we go through that process, it's just hard to see the assumptions that you're truly making if everybody's operating from the same kind of grounding principles. So one of the, I think, key aspects of diversity, and not just diversity of gender or diversity of race, but diversity of geography, diversity of political thought, right? These are the things that allow us to pursue problem solving in a way that moves us towards outcomes that can move our situations forward. So to answer the question, from my perspective, the only way to know what your assumptions are is to hang out with people who are different from you and be like, hey, man, what did I miss on that? And they'd be like, well, actually, that I would never have seen that situation the same way that you did. Or you and I see that very similarly. I wonder what our shared experiences are to create that common lens.
I think that's really excellent. I think that just to highlight something that David just shared as well, and drawing from the military, is the AAR, After Action Report, creating time afterwards to have that space to discuss with your fellow educators or even with your students. Like, what did you like about this? What could I have done better? What are the assumptions that I made? All these different questions that can be asked so that you can create, again, that space and expend that energy to get that feedback, and that David highlighted, and that Tracy and I started with, around being discomfort. And the only way to change is to feel that discomfort, and recognizing that especially folks of color and especially Black folks need to have space to heal as well, because the communities and the world that we live in right now is constantly draining, especially for these folks. And so ensuring that folks have their spaces to refill their cup is really critical when having these difficult conversations. I would also just quickly say it's a consistent unlearning. What we don't realize that we are learning these biases throughout. For example, there's a professor at Tufts, Calvin Gidney, who looks at child development or children's movies. And his key one is around The Lion King and around how accents have particular associations with villains, and good guys have certain other accents that typically are associated with white. So I think those are just things that we have to constantly be aware of as we move through, is that we are constantly unintentionally learning these biases, and we have to be expending energy to combat these biases that we have when trying to educate and teach.
If I might just put one more caveat on this, I think the seminal study here is when you're looking at Brown versus Board of Education, when we're looking at the doll study, right? And they gave a young lady a black doll and a white doll and said, well, which one is prettier? And the young lady, who was a woman of color, a black girl, chose the white doll. And I think when you're looking at 2020, people feel uncomfortable when folks are trying to name these narratives and pushing back. Black is beautiful, Black lives matter, right? It is a counter narrative to the actual evidence of our country has put forth, right? So the reason we say Black lives matter is because when we look at the criminal justice system, when we look at our education system, when we look at the history of our country, there was an intentional narrative that said Black lives don't matter. The Dred Scott decision literally said, Black lives do not matter. You have no rights that we are worth, that a white man needs to respect. So I think the challenge here is that when people see the response, they're reacting to that and saying, well, of course, Black lives matter, right? But without the context, like Tracy was saying, in terms of ethnic studies, without the history, like you were saying, Dina, we're not able to situate these responses, these slogans, within the historical context that allows us to say, Black lives matter today because it did not matter yesterday, right? I'd love to say 200 years ago, but we're getting better, and that's where we need to continue to move forward towards.
Thank you so much for sharing that, David. It's a constant and intentional process of unlearning to learn better, right? And to empty our cups so that we can fill it again, but fill it again with that expansion of possibility of how we all matter and how we can really create a much richer life for the planet if we take into consideration the magic and the marvel that we all bring. And without diversity, we wouldn't. You said the word compete. I think we wouldn't survive to begin with. So I think it's really fascinating, Tracy, David, Andy, what you share. And then there are several questions. I'm gonna try to organize it as there are three questions that I would like to ask each one of you. A question for David: how do we address the fatigue people feel today? How do we energize the effort to push forward? And it says about the Arctic wren. No, yes. So if you can share with us, and please comment, Andy and Tracy, of course.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's two ways we can think about this. First off, we are blessed to live in a country in which the founding documents point us towards an ideal that all men are created equal, right? And we know that the reality of that ideal was not realized and has not yet been realized. Making sure women, Indigenous people, African Americans are part of that social fabric, but at the same time, right, the drum major is pointing towards the time signature that is saying these are our founding documents. And Dr. Martin Luther King gave his "I Have a Dream" speech. He said that America has cashed us a blank check. He said that we want essentially the things that people said that we deserve, right? It's written on the check. We just want to put it in the bank and see it in our account. So the energy comes from being able to move our country towards those ideals. Langston Hughes said, America was never America for me, but this I swear America will be. that's the energy. To be able to make that gap between the ideal right over here and where we're at, that's what should push us forward. And I think the second thing that pushes me forward is the fact that people pushed for me, right? The fact that I am here with Tracy having this conversation means that people believed in the idea of me. Even in the deepest and darkest of their times, they believed that there could be a better situation, a better idea of what America was. And those are the folks who found the energy. So from my perspective, I have no excuses given the life that I have and the benefits and the blessings that have accrued to me to feel fatigue or to feel like I don't have anything to do because folks sacrificed for me. And in the words of Angela Davis, when she was describing some of the contributions made, she says, truly, this is the person who's worthy of the ancestors that delivered them. So I want to be worthy, and I expect folks to find the energy to be worthy of those folks who delivered them here today so that we can deliver those who come after us.
You have a key message, David. You are worthy, and we need to share that worthiness so that with everyone, so that every person knows that and lives the being worthy. And I want to ask a question for Tracy. It says, with the compounded trauma that our communities, with the same question, but focusing on trauma, like how do we push forward beyond the trauma? How do we acknowledge the trauma and then do something with it to transform it?
So when I talk about the race-based trauma, I think that we need to acknowledge what is happening within ourselves, and not just in the way that we cognitively respond, but the ways in which our bodies respond, and the health issues that are implication of that trauma. So a lot of times, and I appreciate what David was saying, thinking about our ancestors who got us to where we are. My great-grandmother was born into slavery. My grandfather was a sharecropper. My parents were civil rights activists. So we continue to go and do that work and push forward. But one of the things we don't do is give ourselves rest. And as a Black woman, there's this superwoman syndrome, right? You show up, you keep going, you do what you do it. And then you look at each other and you say you do it too. We don't give ourselves time to grieve, and we don't give ourselves joy. So I want to talk about Black joy. And other than Black people, I want Black joy to be celebrated, especially when we think about our young people. Don't just talk to them about the trauma and what they came from. Talk to them about the joy and the love that exists within their community. Because if you express that and show them that it's important, then they feel as if it's important. And to the arts and to the poetry and to the music, bring it into your classrooms. There is so much history in that. And to rap and hip hop, understand the language, the lyrics, and engage with them. A lot of times we have a hip hop X lab at the Ed School. Our director of the program will be playing like Cardi B and people will cringe. No, you know what? I want you to lean into it. Think about why she's saying that, where she's coming from, because you can't capture your students if you're not acknowledging the language in which they speak. So just want to say, think about joy, think about art, think about love, and also celebrate it.
This is essential, no? To really become intentional listeners to the joy that there is, and to be able to become experts on capturing that joy and making it blossom, because there is that joy, there is that culture, there is that art and music and talent to be spread, and to also, as I think Andy and David were mentioning a lot, the word energy. No, where do we put our energy? And this is absolutely key. No, it's a decision, it's a choice that we also can make very explicitly and intentionally. So and Tracy, thank you for bringing that. There was there's one of the questions also referring precisely to the joy and asking for you, David, Tracy, and Andy to share your experience and feelings about the role that art, music, art, theater play helping children in feeling empathy, inclusion, connection, and safety.
I'll briefly start and pass it back off to David and Tracy to go further. I do want to briefly take a step back and mention for the folks out there that don't identify as Black or African American, that one definition of privilege is being able to remove oneself from discomfort, right? So that's where, and to answer the question that was posed to David, for that energy, like where do you find that energy? That's where it comes for me personally, is noticing that I have the privilege of being able to remove myself from discomfort in a variety of different of the identities that I hold in different spaces that I go in. And so expanding that effort and that energy to change that so that it is a more equitable space is really key. In the art space, I think that there's a lot to discuss. Something that Tracy mentioned as well in like the books that we encourage young people to read, and the other media forms that we encourage young people to read. The times that they see Black folks shouldn't be only focused around trauma or around civil rights or around slavery. There should be many other ways. Obviously, Black Panther is an easy example of that, showing superhero joy, but there should be other stories that are highlighted in our curriculum that highlight Black joy, people of color joy, Indigenous joy, etc. I think there's some really great work for educators to consume as well. I'd recommend looking at Hip Hop Psych, which is an organization run out of the UK by Dr. Soule and Dr. Becky Inkster, which is really interesting and highlights a lot of the work that Tracy was mentioning. And then in addition to ethnic studies, critical race theory in education, I think is really key. Dr. Adrienne Brown at Brown University has a free curriculum online that you can check out and start reading through that as well. But I'll pass it over to David and Tracy to highlight some other arts.
Well, first, I think I just want to really resonate with what Tracy said in terms of Black joy. When I interview folks of color, one of the first questions I ask is, what's your favorite thing about the Black community, right? What's your favorite thing about being Black? Just to center us in the purpose and the joy in our community. And then, it was so interesting to me, to Tracy's point here, is if you think about hip hop, right? Hip hop is spread all over the world as the voice of those who want to speak truth to power. Right? I mean, amazing. This is a art form that came out from the Bronx. Guys got together, started doing this thing, has worldwide influence, and has been taken in from people who are so different from our situations, like day to day, and said, "Yeah, this speaks to me." I can connect with this. I can speak it in my language. I can speak it in my context. I could use different beats, right? But at the end of the day, this was inspired by the Black experience. So you think about George Gershwin, he played a Rhapsody in Blue, the first kind of opera to come out of the United States. That's blues. That's our music. You think about rock and roll, right? So I really resonate with what Tracy is saying. One of the things that I get challenged with is when this narrative of the Black experience is only one of oppression and not one of resilience. That culture is our legacy. Those are the systems that our forefathers led us and left us in order to work through this world and make it better for our next generation. So I just want to really resonate with what Tracy is saying and the legacy of Black art, its impact on the world, and what it means to be able to participate in that today.
Yeah, I want to follow up to what David and Andy said, because I think in addition to our music and our other forms of art, it's our lives, our lived experiences. I never realized how many people didn't know about HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities, and the Divine Nine, which is our fraternities and our sororities, and stepping and our homecoming until Beyonce put out Homecoming. But Black people loved it because there was so much resonance with that. And Kamala Harris being an AKA, I'm like, just learning those things and understanding those things and how they bring us joy and pride and confidence, I think is a powerful thing for people outside of the Black community to see ways in which you can provide excitement, encouragement, and also self-esteem to young Black people that you are working with. Because if it's not in their history books, and it's not a part of the environments in which they grew up, they don't know it. So for teachers to be able to teach them that and celebrate that with them, it changes. And it changes other young people. Like, this isn't just for Black and brown schools, in white schools, in private schools, in international schools. If you share the Black experience, the Black education prior to Brown versus Board of Education, like, we are really strong, proud, loving people. And, you know, if I can implore anything, it's that, like, share what we celebrate and who we are.
Wow, well said, Tracy. Thank you so much. Yes, it's really a matter of revaluing the joy, the pride, the confidence, the self-esteem, and I would add, and the purpose that all of these contributions bring to the world and to who we all are. So we need to celebrate that and make it as evident as possible, learning our history as well, right? It's part of our history too. And this is something we need to learn and be aware of. We have 3 minutes left. Unfortunately, it has gone by like in a blink. And I want to thank you deeply for participating, for sharing your wisdom, your knowledge, but also for sharing your joy and your purpose. And I want to close with a question, which is, what if you could name one practical advice or a statement that you want to share to close, where we can bring something to our homes to promote equity and inclusion, what would it be?
I think, kind of summing up what everyone said, learn something different, look for something different. And it could be as easy as watching movies with your family.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with Tracy. If you're comfortable, you're stagnant, right? And if you're stagnant, somebody's catching up with you. So that's how I think about things. I want to be number one. I want to be the best. And I know that it takes diversity to get me there. I know that I need diversity of thought. I need diversity of action. I need diversity of perspective to push me, to push my thinking, to get me better. So if people want to elevate themselves, they want to elevate their thinking, they need to look around, stop being comfortable, and start getting out in the world in a way that pushes them forward.
That's amazing. I really appreciate that, Tracy and David. I would just highlight that as you go through this process, be aware of tokenism and be aware of taking the easier way out. Really step into being anti-racist as much as possible, which is calling out racist behaviors, actions, words, whenever and wherever it happens, whether it be in your own home, whether it be yourself, and trying to hold yourself accountable in that. And everybody can fall victim to this because, again, it's in the air that we breathe and the water that we drink. So incorporating that in as much as possible in professional and personal settings, I think, is a constant learning. And I'm still working on it, and we're all working on it, and we're all on our journey. And I think that that's critical to be aware of.
Thank you so much for being so humble, the three of you, for making such a fantastic team in this panel. You really have enlightened us and inspired us. We learned a lot. And of course, this is a conversation that we will want to continue thinking about, learning from. And this is just the beginning. Thank you so much, and see you very soon.
Have a great day.
Thank you, Tracy. Thank you, David. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you all.
Thank you.